Hi, I am Emmeline Smith, and I'm going to be doing my presentation today over the Picture Bride experience in Japanese culture. The lighting in here is really awful, and I really apologize for that. And this screen, I have my TV screen here, which I'm displaying my presentation on, and I know it's kind of hard to see me and it, so I'm just kind of working with the best of what I have, and I really apologize for the quality, so I'll kind of just go back and forth between looking at the slides and looking at me just so you see that I'm giving the presentation. Anyway, like I noted, today we're going to be talking about the picture bride experience for women in the Japanese culture. So look over to my first slide here, which is my handout. You can see, and the three things that are like the main points we're going to be covering today in my slide is going to be the picture bride experience, Ukida's bio, and the social and cultural realities of females in Japan at the turn of the century. So, kind of like in a more detailed explanation of what this means is the picture bride experience is kind of what women experienced in the time of like the very late 1800s, early 1900s. The women often, it's kind of, you can kind of say like, or how, the name of how it sounds is really what it is. Men would give women a picture, and then they would come and sail to America and become brides to these males based off of their pictures. Ukida is going to be about the bio of the story that we read way back when, the Tears of Autumn, and she was one of the picture brides. And then, as I said, we'll discuss like some of the social and cultural realities of females back then and what it was really like for them. And I chose this topic because I just think some of like the way that women were treated and just the way that people were treated in Japan is pretty like fascinating. Like, how they people would have their feet binded up, like the foot binding, and the women would get their toes like so tight into the shoes, and they would have to put them like that. And like years later, you can look at videos and pictures, and it's just like gross, and they like forever ruin their feet. And that's just an example of something that I thought was really interesting. And there are a lot of things I find interesting about Japan and their culture, and that's kind of why I chose this topic. Anyway, on to our next slide here. We have a quote from the story. I'll try and move it up a little closer. So, not a quote from the story, I'm sorry. The definition of what a picture bride is, just so we have a better understanding. The term picture bride refers to a practice in the early 20th century by immigrant workers who married women on the recommendation of a matchmaker who exchanged photographs between the prospective bride and groom. So, I took that quote from an encyclopedia website, but that just kind of sums up what picture brides were, gives a better explanation than perhaps I would give. So picture brides weren't just around during this time period, like in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They've actually been around since the Tokugawa period, which was back in like the early 1600s. And this began to happen more so during the late 1800s, early 1900s when Japanese men would move to America or go to Hawaii, and they went there like looking for better economic opportunities, the whole better life thing. It's America, I want to go there. And so as a result, there's a few reasons why women came over. A few were like there was the passage of the Gentleman's Agreement back then, which kind of prohibited Japanese to travel to America and Hawaii because there was just so many of them coming in, and we couldn't continue to have them. However, if you wanted to start a family and bring a woman over to be your wife, then that was allowed. So that was kind of the way of the Japanese men being able to start a family as long as they had their wife coming over. It was okay for the Japanese women to come over. Um, so, uh, a lot of there weren't really as many women that came over initially. It was more men. So that is just one of the reasons, and also another one of the reasons is that Japanese men wanted to marry Japanese women because instead of American women because they were still kind of stuck in their cultural ways and of life, and so the Japanese women would still continue to live like the cultural ways of the Japan, but American women wouldn't. And like if a man from Japan wanted you to work with him, um, American women wouldn't really have it, but the Japanese women would, and just the way that they were treated. But we'll kind of discuss that further as we go more into my presentation. So let's see. So now we're going to talk about the motives for the Japanese men versus the Japanese women, like why they wanted to go in with the picture bride experience. So Japanese men did it mainly because they wanted a woman from Japan that would conform to their cultural ways still. And they needed someone to marry because it's dishonorable, to not have a wife and start a family. Um, the women were the ones that, and I kind of like discussed earlier why the men wanted Japanese women to come. And it was easier for them to, it may have been easier for them to find a wife in America too if all they had to do was send a picture, because a lot of these men would send pictures of themselves when they were really young. And I mean, and they were maybe like 40 or 50 actually, but they'd send a picture when they were like 18. So the Japanese women would come over thinking that they were going to marry some man of close to their age, and then they'd be surprised. But by then, you know, the deal's already been done and you can't really go back from it. So the Japanese women would stay with their husbands, plus they already made an agreement. The women would go with these, or they would do the whole picture bride situation because they sometimes were, conforming to their familial obligations, or they just had social pressures to do so. Especially if you were a little bit older and you hadn't been married yet, that was pretty dishonorable and socially very unacceptable. And so it was a good way for these women to go and get married. Um, they may have also gone for economic motives to help their families through hard times, or put a younger sibling or family member through school, because if this man promises you lots of money or a good life, you can send that money back and help your family. So, and some women just wanted to go to America and wanted a better life and wanted to see what it was like, and they didn't want to work, like in the rice farms with the rice paddies all day. They thought they could go live like American women when they went to America. So, anyway, next we have the bio of Yoshiko Ukida and the Tears of Autumn. So, this kind of describes what she's like, what she looks like. I don't know if you can see here. Her appearance is thin, small, with dark eyes and a pale face and black hair, so kind of a typical Japanese woman. She's pretty young. She's 21 years old. Before she had gone to America, she lived a very comfortable, rich life. Her father had a lot of money. Her three older sisters married and moved off, but she stayed home with her mother. And it may not have been as comfortable, but she still lived pretty comfortably when she was in Japan. So the shift that happens in the story is her uncle shows her a picture, gives her a description of this man named Taro Takeda, and tells her like, hey, maybe you should get married. Her mom doesn't really want her to leave, but she knows that her daughter needs to go. So in conclusion, Okita sails to America and meets her soon-to-be husband. And well, I guess that's kind of like a synopsis of what goes on in her life. And this is what it was like for a lot of women. They would see the picture, a family member would be like, hey, it's okay, go do it, go meet this man. So they're like, oh, okay, whatever, all right. And so then they go to America, and so it's kind of like familial obligations usually, the pressures of your family. So this is a quote of how she felt in the story and how a lot of Japanese women felt, which it says, It is just that I am terribly nervous. And this is how a lot of Japanese women were on the boats, especially if you go back and read other stories. A lot of Japanese women were really, really nervous. They didn't know what America was going to be like. They didn't know what their husband was going to be like. They didn't know they were getting into. They often got short letters and maybe a picture or two, maybe some promises. They didn't know what was sure. They didn't know how to speak English. They didn't know anything. So they were really nervous and they really didn't know what they were getting themselves into exactly. So, furthermore, here, this is an experience that someone shared. I hope the video is gonna load. Shoot. I'm doing it on my phone, so it's kind of, I don't know if it's gonna work or not. Well, I don't think it's gonna load. It wants to, but every time I click, oh, that's a drawing. Okay, well, I can't click on this. Oh, wait, here we go. Play video.
Well, my father's friend was going to Japan to get his wife, and he had asked this man if he would find him a wife. So he must have been 32, I guess, because it was mom came in 13 and he came in 1900. So this man found my mother, and so they made arrangements for her to come over. She was saying that the one thing she remembers mostly about it was a lot of the ladies had gotten pictures of their future spouses when they were very young. And so when the boat docked in Tacoma, they were really upset because here were these old men waiting for these young girls. My mother was much older, so it didn't bother her, and she knew where she was going. But she said she felt very sorry for some of the girls because they were very young. And she said a lot of them just ran away after seeing their husbands.
Okay, so anyway, furthermore, we discuss the Japanese women in late 1800s and through the early 1900s. So the late-ish 1800s was the Edo Tokugawa period, and women had no legal rights and had to be subordinate to men. But post World War II, women could vote, they had parental rights, could marry and divorce. This was way later in the 1900s, though. Beforehand, women didn't really have a lot of education. The men and women usually worked side by side. Women had no rights, whatever the husband said went. If he wanted to beat you, then fine. Like, he's gonna beat you. If he wanted to sleep around on you, you had to, deal with it. If he wanted to have his way with you, even though you didn't want it, the women had to put up with it. And it wasn't really till after World War II that these women started to see their rights in more so America than Japan. So anyway, it wouldn't be a while until women would begin to see some freedoms, but they were kind of they didn't have a lot of rights or freedoms, and so that kind of concludes my presentation here. And here are my sources. I'm sorry about the circumstances. I tried to make the best with what I could do, and I will email my PowerPoint to you, and yeah, that should be that.